Let me just lead off by saying predicting the future is hard. And I want to show you something. I have 3 postcards from the year 1900 that the illustrator was asked to predict what life might be like in the year 2000. And I just want to show you these postcards. Okay, here's one. They imagined that steamships would also have railroad wheels on them because steamships were big and the railroad was big. So, of course, in 100 years, you would combine the two of them and you would just drive right off the ocean onto the land. Here's another one. Of course, everyone would just be floating on the water because, of course, that's what we want to do in the future. Here's my favorite. Remember, this is 1900. Powered airplanes began in 1903. But, of course, people wanted to fly. And so here people just flying. Not imagining that if any of those fell out of the sky, you would just be dead. So predicting the future is often an exercise in extending what you already know, but not inventing something completely new out of left field and out of the ether. So it's possible to predict the future within 10 years, maybe 20, because often that is an extension of what you know. But beyond 30 or 40 years, 50 years, it's an almost hopeless exercise, given the pace of technology that we have, given the rate at which technology converges in ways that are not obvious and could not have been extrapolated at the time you engaged in that exercise. I also want to offer you some what I would call embarrassing quotes, space quotes. Often people look in the literature and they find futurists, and they pick the 1 or 2 predictions they made and say, look, they knew the future. Well, I did the opposite of that. I collected quotes from important people that were just plain wrong. They're often just forgotten because we like to remember the hits and not the misses. Here, we are remembering the misses. From 1900, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a New York City newspaper. It is scarcely possible that the 20th century will witness improvements in transportation that will be as great as were those in the 19th century. That has got to be the most boneheaded comment ever printed in a newspaper editorial. Again, they were riding high on steamships, and the internal combustion engine car was a recent invention. The country was crossed by railroads, and they're saying, oh my gosh, nothing can top this. And in 3 years, we have an airplane. 66 years after that, we've landed on the moon. So this exercise in predicting the future is rife with embarrassing moments. How about this one? Man will not fly for 50 years. Who said that? Wilbur Wright to his brother, Orville, in 1901, 2 years before they both flew. You think if the 2 guys who invented airplanes can't get it right, what hope do the rest of us have? Here's another one. No flying machine will ever fly from New York to Paris. This is a trend that will continue up until 1957. The trend is there is some advance, and people constrain that advance. So this quote came out after we knew how to fly. Now they're saying we'll never fly to Paris. Who said this? Orville Wright, 1908. How about this one? Landing and moving around on the moon offers so many serious problems for human beings that it may take science another 200 years to lick them. Science Digest, August 1948. It did not take 200 years after this. It took how long? 20 years, 21 years. So these are people who should know better. This is a magazine that thinks about science. Technology was surely advanced then. So what was missing? Well, let's keep going. Man will never reach the moon, regardless of all future scientific advances. Radio pioneer Lee DeForest. What's significant about this is that it's on February 1957. This is 6, 7 months before Sputnik. 9 months before Sputnik, launched October 4th, 1957. The moment that happened, the instant that happened, all of this changed. All of a sudden, the technology became real. The ambitions became real. And then people went back into the future predicting business, but then they began to overpredict. It happened basically overnight. A manned lunar base will be in existence by 1986. Who says that? The futurists, 1967. The Apollo program is already in progress. So we know space is within access to our technologies. But we're assuming that we'll continue at that rate. Sorry, I didn't finish the quotes on the other side. We assumed that what was in progress would continue unabated. And that assumption was based on deeply false premises. Let me not use the word false, I'll be more severe and say deeply delusional premises. A premise that I will attempt half of this talk to convince you of. How about this? I'm convinced that before the year 2000 is over, the first child will have been born on the moon. Who said that? Wernher von Braun, the guy who invented the Saturn V rocket. So people are, again, thinking that the pace that had been put into play was something natural for the human spirit, the human DNA. What else were we predicting for the year 2000? By the year 2000, 50,000 people will be living and working in space. 50,000. I checked. In the year 2000, there were 3 people living and working in space on the International Space Station. Mixed in with this is also some foggy memory, particularly on my side of the ocean. Okay? In America, we think of ourselves as space pioneers. It's easy to think that because we landed on the moon. It's easy to think that we were driven by a certain sort of intrinsic patriotism, an intrinsic pride. But if you unpack it, that's not what shows up. Here's a quote, "I'm not that interested in space." John Kennedy said that to the head of NASA in 1962. The man who we all associate with launching the Apollo program. This came out of his mouth. This is, whether we like it or not, a race. Everything we do ought to be tied to getting to the moon ahead of the Russians. John Kennedy to James Webb. This is not, oh, it's exploration, isn't it beautiful? It is. There was no such dialogue. Here's a bust of President Kennedy in Kennedy Space Center, Florida, and chiseled in the granite. "I believe this nation should commit itself before the decade is out to put a man on the moon, return him safely to Earth." We all can hear those words. They're stirring. What they left out is the speech where that quote comes from was to a joint session of Congress 6 weeks after Yuri Gagarin came out of orbit. The United States did not have a rocket that wouldn't explode on takeoff, a human-rated rocket. So we freaked out. Does that translate in the translators? Freak out? I don't know how else to say that. That's the word. We freaked out. So what he says before this is, if we are to show the world the path of freedom over the path of tyranny, then we need, if the events of recent weeks, wouldn't even mention Yuri Gagarin's name, if the events of recent weeks are any indication of the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere, then we need to show the world the path of freedom over the path of tyranny. It was a war driver. That was in the same speech where this quote was uttered. Why didn't we put that in the granite? Plenty of space to chisel in, beat the Russians. That's left out. Well, yes, we went to the moon. Yes. Yes. Yes, we did this. Driven by Cold War fear. So all the people who were not thinking Cold War fear, thinking that going to the moon was just the thing people do, when we stopped going to the moon, people cried foul. People said, we just need the charisma that Kennedy had and that'll fix everything. We just need the political will like we used to have. No, what we needed is Russians who want to go to the moon ahead of us. There was a side benefit. This photo, Apollo 8. This is the 50th anniversary this year of that photo, December. Apollo 8 goes to the moon, orbits 15 times, does not land. It is the first time we leave Earth for another destination, ever. In some ways, this is more significant than Apollo 11. No one had left Earth before. Yeah, we go into orbit. People like to think of that as leaving Earth, but not really. In a schoolroom globe, this International Space Station is orbiting half a centimeter above the globe. And we've all sort of bought into the idea that that's space. To an astrophysicist, that's just driving around the block. After this photo was taken, here's what happened. Something unexpected. We went to the moon to explore the moon, and we discovered Earth for the first time. No one had seen this before. Spaceship Earth. Earth as nature intends you to view it. Not with color-coded countries, as in your schoolroom, but with just oceans and land and clouds. This was the beginning of the modern environmental movement. What happens between 1968 and 1973? What happens? 1970, Earth Day is established. Why didn't we establish that in 1960 or 1950? We were going to the moon when Earth Day was established. DDT was banned in 1973. Leaded gasoline was banned in the United States. Many other countries followed suit thereafter. Comprehensive Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. The organization Doctors Without Borders was founded. That was founded in Switzerland. They probably would have formed anyway, but would they have called themselves Without Borders? I don't think so. Where do you even get that state of mind? Unless you saw Earth from space. So you can ask, what is the cost benefit of going into space? This one, I think, was unimagined. That all of a sudden, Earth would have a shared fate in how good or bad we shepherd its future. So now you have to ask, what's your budget for space exploration? A series of talks at this conference? Talk about weather satellites, missions to Mars, this sort of thing? You should know this. If your monies are established by a tax base funded by an electorate, research with unknown returns on investments in fields not yet fully understood by the public. This is really hard to get money for. But you know what it's not hard to get money for? I'll tell you. Here it is. I was invited to write a chapter for the Columbia History of the 20th Century on exploration. And I hemmed and hawed, and I finally agreed. I was going to make a grid of all the most expensive things civilization has engaged in, and look at how much it cost and what they did to get the thing paid for. And I thought to myself, if we're going to send people to Mars, I find that on the grid and find out what motivated the people to pay that. and then we could learn from the history of civilization. When I did this exercise, I arrived at only 3 drivers that enabled a nation to commit large sums of money. One is obvious: war. People will spend almost any amount of money to not die. And so what kind of projects come under war and defense? The Apollo program, initiated out of fear of the Russians. The Manhattan Project, huge diversion of funds in the middle of the Second World War by the United States with an international team of scientists. The Great Wall of China, a huge undertaking. The interstate system in the United States, it's just roads, of course. However, the interstate system, roads built to a specification, established by Eisenhower after he saw the Autobahn in Germany in the Second World War. The Autobahn did not wash out in the rain. It supported troop movements and tanks. And he said, I want one of those. In came the interstate system, $100 billion. In fact, the interstate system cost the same as the Apollo program, motivated by not wanting to die, moving material and personnel around. What's number 2? This is not as common today. Used to be common: praise of deity or royalty. From that, you get the pyramids, and you get Versailles, you get like cathedral building in Europe as an activity. Huge investments in financial and physical capital. Today, royalty is not as powerful over nations as it was 300, 400, 500 years ago. So you don't see this today so much. The third, and another obvious one, but it's a total of 3, promise of economic return. There you get Columbus and Magellan and Lewis and Clark. There's no end of this list. So what this comes down to is, I don't want to die, and I don't want to die poor. That will invest in practically anything. Notice on this list is not, let's explore, let's do this for science, let's do this because it's in our DNA. You could make that argument, and you could fund below a certain radar level a project, depending on the wealth of your nation. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, depending on the wealth of your nation. You could do projects where this is not relevant. But once the price starts getting higher, you're up against people's personal rejection of what might look like the activity of others for their own gain, whereas everybody benefits if the nation sees an economic return or if you don't die. So these 3 forces, war, royalty, economics, are powerful. So I've used this to judge whether anything will ever happen. Are we going to put humans on Mars? Only if somebody judges that you have to do it, otherwise you would die. Kings are not going to do it anymore, or somebody's going to make a buck. That's my cynicism that I'm bringing to this conference, based on the history of human conduct. Predicting the future, another example of how hard it is to predict the future. Collier's magazine had a now famous series of articles on our future in space. This is early. This is before Sputnik, before anybody launched anything. But we had the science. We had some of the engineering. And we had the artists. In a series of conferences at the Hayden Planetarium in New York City, a series of articles came out. And people were delighted. The world's first spacesuit. How and where we'll use it. This is a level of enthusiasm that is building. And there's a whole discussion about the physiology of going into space and the challenges. And it's on the right-hand side: meteorites, cosmic rays, weightlessness, glare, disorientation, boredom, irritability, and fatigue. Those last 3 would affect us even if we're not in space. I don't know why they put it up there. That's why they would list that as a priority. So here's one that will matter if you want to have settlements. They're thinking about this. Who owns the universe? Who owns it? You're going to settle? You're going to pitch tent? Does anybody own it? Why would you have unlimited access on the surface of another planet when you don't have unlimited access on this planet? On this planet, we're all human, yet you have to show papers to cross an artificial border established by politics. That's how we conduct our affairs on this earth. Any reason to think that's going to be different in space? What else do we have here? Can we survive in space? People had to think this through. Let's keep going. Man will conquer space soon. We're getting closer. Okay, we're not just the spacesuit now. Top scientists tell how in startling pace. Here we go. What are we waiting for? So the engineering is in place. They just don't have money for it yet. So they're waiting for the money. They don't know that the money will only come if someone finds diamonds on the moon or if we're at war in some technological composition with an adversary. They don't know this upon writing this article. They have no idea. Here's another one. Man on the moon. Let's take a look inside. This is a supply ship. The fuel canisters are the spheres. There's other supplies on the central zone. And you can look at, this is inside the moon ship. This is highly ambitious. There's like 30 people there. How do you get, I don't know. And I like it's got this little antenna sticking out the side, you know. You'd have to build this, launch it, get it to the moon, and have, now, is anyone asking, why would you do this? They're enchanted by the capacity to think it through more than they are the reality of whether anyone will actually do it. Then we go beyond moons. How about Mars? Can we get to Mars? Is there life on Mars? Mars, we knew Mars has an atmosphere, so you can have an airplane, but it's a much thinner atmosphere, so you need huge wingspan relative to the fuselage so that you can get the lift that you need. Now, these look like really heavy tanks. I don't know how they got these tanks to Mars. That's not really discussed. It's just there. Again, why are you on Mars? You want to live there? Okay. What's motivating it? What's paying for it? Here's the problem. You might say, private enterprise will do it. No. My read of history tells me no. Let me repeat that. No. Not because I don't want it to be so. I'm just a realist about this. Let me tell you how much of a realist I am. I published a book a couple of years ago. It was called Space Chronicles, Facing the Ultimate Frontier. That's not the title I submitted it with to the publisher. The title I submitted it with was Failure to Launch, the Dreams and Delusions of Space Enthusiasts. And the publisher said, no, we can't have that title. It's got the word failure in it, and they were spooked by the language of the title. So it had a much more pleasant sounding Space Chronicles. Here's why it's not going to happen. There is no capital market valuation of the space frontier. It's expensive. Here's how that meeting will go. I run a company, and I want to send people to Mars. No one has done it before. I invite in the investors. This is how capitalism works. You have investors. And they ask questions. They say, how much will it cost? Well, a lot. What will be the return on this investment? I don't know, probably nothing. Well, is it dangerous? Yes. Will people get hurt? They'll probably die. That is a 3-minute meeting with the venture capitalists. The history of this exercise is that governments lead. Governments have long-term interest in the success of technology over a longer period of time than any corporate entity could possibly justify. Corporations have quarterly reports, annual reports, shareholders. A government can say, we will do this and it'll pay back in 10 or 20 years, and just do it, as governments have been doing throughout the history of this exercise. The first Europeans to the New World was not the Dutch East India Trading Company. It was Columbus, sent by the Queen of Spain. Italy wouldn't even send him. They were busy building cathedrals. That's why the New World does not speak Italian. They speak Spanish in all of South America, almost all of South America. If you want to talk about the reach of a country, what is her motivation? A little bit of hegemony, but it's primarily economics. Give me a short route to India. He thought he found India. Hence, the native people in North America were called Indians. I'm just amazed that stuck. To this day, I don't know who made that stick as a name for the Native Americans. Before we had railroads, Lewis and Clark mapped the whole western frontier of the United States. Space shuttle cargo. Why was NASA bringing cargo to the space station? Like, why? If NASA is going to be a frontier agency, you bring in corporations to do the routine things what they can do efficiently and effectively. That's what SpaceX has been doing recently. SpaceX brought up some supplies to the space station, banner headlines, new era in space, what will happen next? Will private enterprise lead? They just took cargo to the space station. Cargo. That actually should have been happening decades ago. Anytime anything happens that's routine by a government, it should then be farmed out to private enterprise, paid by the government. The government could have whatever reasons it needs, geopolitical, for security reasons, whatever is the reason, economic, with a long-term goal. Let's take a look at Mars as a modern object of our affection. First, before we go to Mars, let's first talk about Antarctica. Antarctica is warmer and wetter than any place on Mars. I don't see people lined up I'm sorry, I don't see that. Gee, I want to have condos in Antarctica. Doesn't stop people. By the way, I will never stop someone with ambition, because ambition here could lead to other things here, even if this higher goal is not achieved. So I will never stand in anybody's way, unless you ask me my opinion. What got a lot of attention the last few years was Mars 1, announced by Baz Luhrmann. To me, what was intriguing about this is the Dutch were explorers from way back, mostly with economic interests, as in on the Earth, in the age of the great periods of exploration. And so we have a Dutch person doing the same thing now with Mars. He wants to create a permanent human colony of 4 people beginning in 2032. So he's got investors, okay? How is he going to pay for it? He's going to televise it like the Olympics. Now, it takes 9 months to get there. That's a lot of television time to fill, but okay, it's a plan.